Hello, my name is Patience Chilemaya and I am going to be your biology tutor. We'll be looking at all the topics that are contained in WAEC and JAMB syllabus for biology. Now, in this video, being our first video, we'll be looking at living organisms. Now, first, we will be looking at the characteristics of living organisms. That is, what makes a living thing living and what makes it different from a non-living thing. We have activities that show that organisms are living. Their activities include movement, nutrition, reproduction, respiration, excretion, and so on. Now we'll be discussing each one of them after the other. The first we'll be discussing is movement. Movement just refers to moving a whole or part of a body from one place to another. For plants, their movement is usually fixed because they can't move their entire body. You can't see a plant just lift itself from the root and start relocating. But in the case of animals, they have a more advanced degree of movement. They can move their whole body from one place to another. Now, the second characteristic is nutrition. All living things need food to survive and carry out their life processes. So, in order to do this, they obtain food in a process known as nutrition. And we have types of nutrition. We have the autotrophic nutrition, which is for green plants that are able to produce their own food, while we also have heterotrophic nutrition. This is a kind of nutrition exhibited by animals that depend directly or indirectly on plants for their food. Now we move on to the third characteristics. We call it the respiration. Now when we eat food with the aim that it's going to give us energy, right? Good. Respiration is therefore the process through which living organisms now release energy from the energy-rich substances that they have consumed during the process of nutrition. The fourth characteristic is growth. Now, growth is an irreversible increase in size. For living organisms, they can increase in size, length, and mass when they are young, but when they reach maturity, a certain level of maturity, they tend to only increase in size. Now, a difference between animals and plants is that animals have a definite period of growth and have a definite number of parts they are allowed to grow. Like you don't see a human being with 3 arms or 5 heads. We have a definite number of body parts that we are allowed to grow and when we are actually allowed to grow them. But in the case of plants, they grow throughout their life. As long as they're still living, they continue growing. And there's no limit to the number of parts a tree can have. There's no limit to the number of branches, the leaves, or roots that they can have. We now move over to excretion. Excretion is just the process by which living organisms remove waste products that are gotten from the breakdown of foods in their body. We have to remove them because sometimes they turn out to be poisonous. And even if they're not poisonous, the body is not using them. So we cannot leave them to be accumulating in the body. So we need to remove them from the body through the process called excretion. Now, the next characteristic of living thing is reproduction. There is no living organism that lives forever. Therefore, we need reproduction to ensure a continuation of life. We define this reproduction as the process through which an organism gives rise to a young one, known as the offspring, to ensure this continuation of life we are talking about. Then we have number 7, irritability or sensitivity. Now this is the ability of an organism to detect and respond to the internal and external stimuli. I'll give you an instance. When you touch a hot object, you withdraw your hand quickly. Now, in this case, the hotness is the stimulus, while the withdrawal is the response to that stimulus. Now for plants just correspond slowly to the external stimuli, while animals respond very quickly to both internal and external stimuli. Now we have adaptation also. Briefly, adaptation is just ability to adapt to changes in the environment in order to survive. Like in the environment of living organisms, there's usually a moment of unfavorable situations or conditions. So this adaptation is the ability of the living organism to actually survive it. Now, we have competition. They are necessities of life, you agree with me. These necessities of life include food, water, space, and things like light. Now, living things need these necessities to survive. But then, most times, these necessities are limited. So there is competition, there is a struggle to obtain them in order to survive. Finally, we have lifespan. Lifespan is the definite or limited period of existence of an organism, and it has 5 main stages. First, we have birth, then growth, then maturity, decline, and finally death. Now, if you go through all these characteristics that we've talked about, you agree with me that a wooden bench does not do all these things because it is not living, okay? You don't find non-living things growing, you don't find them reproducing. You would certainly be shocked if you find a seed reproducing another seed, okay? So these are just differences between non-living things and living things. So we'll also look at cell structure and function of the cell components. Majorly, a cell is composed of both a cytoplasm and a nucleus. Now, the cytoplasm is jelly-like and transparent and contains about 90% of water. Inside it, we have all the cell components like Golgi body, mitochondria, and the rest. Then, inside the cell as well, we have the nucleus that is bounded by the nuclear membrane. Now, let's take these components one after the other and see how they function in the body. Now, we have the cell wall inside the cell. It is non-living and serves as a boundary for the cell, and it is made up of cellulose. What it does is that it supports, shapes, and protects the cell. We also have the cell membrane. The cell membrane just allows movement of materials in and out of the cell. We have lysosomes. Lysosomes are tiny bodies that are found in animal cells. What they do is that they contain enzymes that catalyze breakdown of proteins, carbohydrates, and foreign bodies. And number 4, we have nucleus. It controls all cellular activities in the cell. It is inside this nucleus that you'll find chromosomes that have genetic materials like the DNA and the RNA. Commonly, we call them genes. Now, we also have the ribosomes. The ribosomes are responsible for protein synthesis. We have chloroplasts. Now, chloroplast is just found in green plants, and they contain green pigments known as chlorophyll that is used during photosynthesis. We also have endoplasmic reticulum. What it does is that it serves as the taxi of the cell. It transports materials within various parts of the cell. Now, we have the vacuole. They have 2 types. The first one is the contractile vacuole, which is in charge of excretion. And then the second one is the osmoregulation and food vacuole that oversees digestion of food in the cell. Now, we have the powerhouse known as the mitochondria. Now, the mitochondria is called the powerhouse because it is the site for cellular respiration and energy production. Then the Golgi bodies or apparatus. What they do is that they secrete enzymes and regulate bodily water, as well as is involved in cell wall formation. Now, there are similarities between plant and animal cells. Similarities like them having cell membranes, ribosomes, Golgi bodies, nuclear membrane, mitochondria, nucleus, and the plasmic reticulum, and etc. But then there are also differences that exist between the plant and animal cells. We'll just go over them very quickly. Now, for animal cells, they possess small vacuole with cells without cell sap, while plant cells possess very large vacuole with sap. Then animal cells have cellulose cell wall absent, while the plant cell have cellulose cell wall present. Now, animal cells appear irregular in shape and have central present, while plant cells are definite in shape and their central is absent. Now, animal cells also stores carbohydrates as glycogen and stores lipids as fats, while plant cells stores carbohydrates as starch and lipids as oils. Now, the animal cells finally has no chloroplast because they are not food producers, so they don't have any business with photosynthesis. That is why on the side of plant cells, they have chloroplasts because they produce food using process called photosynthesis. Now we have level of organization of life. Every living thing, every one of them is made up of a cell or a number of cells. And when an organism is made up of one cell, it is called unicellular, while when it is made up of many cells, it is known as multicellular. So organization of life now is the existence of life from a single-celled organism to a multicellular organism with a more complex form. There are 4 levels of organization of life that exist, and they are namely the cell, tissue, organ, and system. We'll look at each of them now. First is cell. A cell is a functional and structural unit of protoplasm that is bounded by a membrane and containing the nuclear and the cytoplasmic materials. Now, some living organisms just exist as these cells, and they include amoeba, the paramecium, euglena, and some others. Now, in plants and animals, we also have cells. Cells like the sperm cells, the nerve cells, bone cells, red blood cells, etc., and they perform a distinct function. The next level is the tissues. Tissue here is a collection of cells which are similar in structure and functions. The hydra is an example of an animal that is made up of tissues only. Now, in plants and animals, we now have tissues like epithelial tissue, the blood, nerve tissue, muscle tissue, xylem phloem tissues, and many more. Then we have organ. An organ is a collection of different tissues that perform a common function. Now, an example of a plant that is an organ is the onion bulb. Then in plant and animal, we now have as organs kidney, heart, brain, stem, roots, etc. Now, the next level is the system. A system is a set of organs which cooperate to carry out one of the vital functions of life. Example of a system is the digestive system. There's also respiratory system, reproductive system, transport system, and a whole lot of them. Now, you will notice something that from the cell, the next level is like a collection of the previous one. That is, the tissue is a collection of cells, the organ is a collection of tissues, while the system is a collection of organs. That is why we call it levels of life. Now, there are complexities that exist in this organization of life, especially for higher organisms. Knowing that unlike unicellular organisms that just exist as cells, higher organisms have bodies that are differentiated into specialized parts that perform specific functions. These different specialized parts are made up of the tissues, organs, and systems that we just looked at. Now, these specialized parts now make life more complex for the higher organism. This complexity now exists in form of structure, function, activity, behavior, and sometimes the entire mode of life of the organism. In comparison to the unicellular organisms, there are advantages and disadvantages of this complexity. Now, one of the advantages is that it leads to division of labor and specialization. The heart is already specialized for pumping of blood. The brain is specialized for nervous coordination and so many other parts of our body as higher organisms. So there is efficiency of the various organs that are involved. So the kidney is not dragging the work of the liver is not dragging the work of the brain, and everything just functions well like a smooth, well-oiled machine. Now, another advantage of complexity is that in higher animals, it leads to adaptation, like survival in different habitats, because they have specialized parts that work different functions for them. Now, in various systems of higher organisms, there is operation side by side with other organs. That is to say that the kidney works well with the liver around it, and it does not even affect it. The liver does not affect the work of the kidney does not affect the work of the blood system and the rest. Now, in reproduction, for complex organisms, it does not lead to disintegration of the parents. Seen in the unicellular organism, they tend to reproduce through division. That is, they call it the binary fission, where the parent has to split into two and form a young one. You can imagine if your parents, maybe your mom or your dad, was required to be divided into two for the other half of him to be you. It's a funny way to view reproduction. It does not happen like that in the higher organisms. Now, there are disadvantages of this complexity. For individual cells, they are not capable of existing independently on their own because they depend on each other's activity to be able to survive. With complexity, ability to regenerate lost parts is decreased. You don't see a man that has lost a limb growing back the limb. It's not being seen. But for unicellular organisms, when there is a lost part, they tend to regenerate it. Now, another disadvantage of complexity is that there is difficulty in the acquisition of food material and release of waste products. Now, this is because for unicellular organisms, it's just by the process of diffusion. You just give it out to their environment through their cell membrane and then collect the food nutrients that they need. But it does not happen that way in the higher organism. The human, for example, we have to ingest food, then it goes down through different processes before we can even excrete the waste products. Another disadvantage is the difficulty seen in reproduction, where we don't have to divide to form young ones. Rather, we have the entire reproductive system for it. Now, lastly is the slower rate of diffusion seen in complex organisms. Now, compared to unicellular organisms, their surface area to volume ratio is small because it's just a cell. So it's easy for diffusion to occur. But in the human body or higher organisms where there is stack of different number of cells and in different shapes, in different forms, it's not that easy to just pass something into one cell and that is all. It has to go through all the cells. So that is why we say that for higher organisms, the surface area to volume ratio is usually small. And that wraps it up for this video. We've seen the characteristics of living things. We've seen the cell and its structures and with their functions. We've also seen the organization of life as well as complexity that exists in higher organisms. Now, this is not all that is to be unfolded about biology. We are moving on to many other videos. So I advise that you draw your seat close and pay attention.